for your work, and also to thank Lauren Harris and Rachel Brown of the AUC Art Collective team for all of their work in arranging today's conversation. I also want to give a shout out and continued support to uplift the healthcare workers and people who are truly on the front lines of this national and global pandemic and national crisis. And finally, I just want to give a shout out to our students and faculty members at the Atlanta University Center, Clark Atlanta University, Morehouse College, and Spelman College. We are the AUC Art Collective, the first and only program in the United States that is designed specifically to be a pipeline for African American students, scholars, and intellectuals who are interested in changing the world and changing specifically the art world and the art industry. So welcome, Jessica. We're really happy.
Thank you.
Here. Yeah, and
it's good to see your face.
It's great to see your face too. It's been a while. I think the last time that I saw you was actually on the occasion of the very first launch of your book in Georgia at an artist residency called Serenbe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's the last time we had a chance to actually, physically connect. But I wanted to just ask if you could please begin by sharing with us what was the impetus for Road Through Midnight?
Sure. So thank you so much, Cheryl. Thank you to the AUC Art Collective. I love the work you guys are doing. And I had the pleasure of speaking to some of your students earlier this month, which was a really rigorous and engaged conversation, which I enjoyed. So so this is Road Through Midnight, the book.
Yay.
And I started the book. I know, finally. I started the book after a visit to Montgomery is when I really started the research, and the book kind of evolved from there. Hey, Chris. And so I was in Montgomery. I was with my cousin. We'd actually we'd driven from Vernon, Alabama, in the northwest part of the state where my family is from. He had to drive to Montgomery to go break up with his girlfriend in person. And I hitched a ride and walked around downtown where I'd never been, even though my mother was from there, was born there, and my paternal grandfather was from there. And my paternal grandfather was a Church of Christ preacher who actually preached at the same time Martin Luther King Jr. was preaching there, and remembered kind of waving to him in neighboring congregants' yards. And I was downtown Montgomery near the current Legacy Museum that the Equal Justice Initiative has started there, and found myself on a brick pavilion with a ornate fountain, and a historical marker was on the site. And if it's all right, I'll just read what the marker said.
Please. And just want to give a shout out to Lewis Watts. Lewis Watts just joined us.
I know. I'm trying to keep an eye out on who's there. I think I saw Dr. Deb get on earlier.
All right.
My sister Jen is here. So I was on the Court Square kind of pavilion down from the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama. And the historical marker said this: the city's slave market was at the Artesian Basin, parentheses, Court Square. Slaves of all ages were auctioned along with land and livestock, standing in line to be inspected. Public posters advertised sales and included gender, approximate age, first name, parentheses, slaves did not have last names, skill, price, complexion, and owner's name. In the 1850s, able field hands brought $1,500, skilled artisans $3,000. In 1859, the city had 7 auctioneers and 4 slave depots, one at Marker Street, parentheses, Dexter Avenue in Lawrence, another at the corner of Perry and Monroe, and 2 on Market between Lawrence and McDonough. And when I was in front of that marker was erected in 2001, and I was there in 2002 in the summer. And I was struck with kind of this question of what does it mean for histories to be erased from the public view, from the public consciousness, and the kind of the collective consciousness of our history, and then for that history to reemerge in the presence of this historical marker being placed there. And realizing, had it not been there, I would not have known where I was standing. I would not have known that piece of history. And so it made me start to ask questions about what else I did not know, because it was not included in our greater kind of collective narrative from the civil rights era and of American history.
Right. And I can actually picture exactly where you were standing when you saw that marker and that memorial. Last year, when I had a class at Spelman College, the course is Slavery and Visual Culture. We took a trip to Montgomery, to the Legacy Museum, to the memorial, and one of the things that was striking for us too is that, you know, it's the historical marker that you reference. Had it not been there, what would you not have known? How might it have changed what you saw, the path that you might have taken? But also thinking about the way that certain things are named. One of the things that was most striking to us is that we took a walk down to the river in Montgomery, and that main broad street that leads up to where the memorial is that you just described, or rather the marker that you just described, is named Commercial Street, right? And that was the commerce of bringing enslaved people from barges and boats from the river that would have been marched up Commercial Street in order to have been sold at that site that you just referenced.
Yeah. And that tunnel that comes up from the river to Court Square, where this marker was. I think some other things you still find in Montgomery, this is where language and the way that we mark and acknowledge and the way that we tell stories are so important, because they lead to how we act in the world. But some of the language along the river still talks about commodities that were brought up the river. It doesn't mention enslaved peoples. It still is mentioning commodities, which is a real kind of denial and refusal to acknowledge painful histories and take responsibility.
Exactly. So one of the things that, you know, strikes me about this work is that it took some time. You mentioned that was in 2002 that you had taken that trip to Montgomery. And I mean, when I think about what has happened in almost the past 20 years since 2002, even when you were there, let's talk about the work of Brian Stevenson and the Legacy Museum, right? So that's a place that we know is a really important site to visit, to become educated, and also to think about how your project would have transformed over this nearly 20-year period. That, you know, the form that you chose to publish it. You're an educator. You're at Florida State University in Tallahassee. You're a professor of photography, so you're an artist working in the department where you're working with practicing artists who are photographers. And you state in the very beginning of the book that this is not a scholarly work, but rather something that is an interpretation, right? And I'd like for you to talk about maybe the layered way in which your book is organized, and how it also, I think, speaks volumes to your lifelong commitment to social justice.
Thank you. Some people, when people ask me like about the kind of trajectory of this initial question coming in 2002, the book coming out in 2020, like what happened during all that time? I think one thing that we realize as artists and as researchers, which I wouldn't have really kind of considered myself a researcher before I started this project, was research takes you in all these different places, and you kind of have to figure out like, what is your entry point into this project and what form will it take? And I did a lot of research on markers and memorials. I went to the Oklahoma City bombing memorial, I went to Sitting Bull, I stopped at roadside markers, and then I went to Kelly Ingram Park in Birmingham, which is really where this crystallized for me. And that, you know, seeing all those sculptures in Kelly Ingram Park that were repeating media images from the time, again, kind of reinforced that question of what's being left out. Like, if we're now repeating media images in our memorials, we're kind of, we're keeping the history in a certain kind of sphere. And again, what's outside of that? And that's really what led me to question. what's outside of the city center, what was happening outside of the news cameras. And
I was going to say, like, what's accessible? There's always this 3-second lag when we're talking to one of them. But you're also making me think about, like, what's accessible? How can we access this history? Even if we don't have, like, right now we're all kind of sequestered, sheltering in place. We don't have the ability to go to that marker or memorial that, that started you on your own journey.
Yeah. Access is a huge thing. And that was, again, part of this project. I was driving to county seat libraries and going through microfiche. A lot changed after the Emmett Till Cold Case Act in 2008, when more research was made available. But yeah, I mean, in terms of access, like, I was having to go and access microfiche, actual newspaper documents. I think also a big part of this book is the involvement of family members and journalists. Family members who lost loved ones at the time, and journalists who investigated cold cases, now have been investigating cold cases now, and journalists who were writing then. And that takes trust too. So and trust takes time. So that was also part of what took time in this book. But yeah, you were asking about were you asking about the structure of the book as well?
Right, because it's a book that is, first of all, it's beautifully printed and really thoughtfully put together. One that is a project of, your hard work in research, but your collaboration too through oral histories and interviews with relatives and friends of loved ones who had lost people. But as you mentioned, it's one that also mines the archive, so that you've gone to many of these different archives. You've looked at paper clippings through, we use the word microfiche, something that a lot of people, today are probably like, what's that? That's something of the 19th century. But many of us are still using microfiche in cases, especially like this. And then also the involvement of the Southern Poverty Law Center, I think, is something that really took your project in a different direction, to think about the kinds of resources that institutions like that are able to collect and make foundational for the kind of work that we do, that is social justice motivated, even for students, I would say, especially to all of our students who are out there listening and joining in, students who are interested in art history. There are ways that you can use these kinds of archives as well in your own work.
Well, and the Southern Poverty Law Center was very key. I mean, I kind of cold called Penny Weaver, who was their director of communications, and she was interested in what I was doing and allowed me access. And when I got there, they have their wall, and now they have a new gallery. It's not that new anymore, of the kind of forgotten ones, but I really wanted to know, like, who didn't make it onto the wall. And I wanted to see those files and kind of understand, because I was still really probing, like, how do we collectively remember? Like, how do we structure these memorials? Because they really determine which stories get told, and so which ones out. And they were incredibly generous with sharing those files with me. And also, as you know, and as your students might be finding out, like, if you want to do any freedom of information FOIA requests, as an individual, that's really difficult. But Southern Poverty Law Center had a lot of that work already done. So if you want to access FBI files that are heavily redacted, et cetera, you will have more success through an institution like the SPLC than you will as an individual.
Right. And you also point out too that in doing this kind of work, I mean, you're combining, your work as a photographer, your eye as a photographer, but I think in discussing the cold cases, you're also talking about how difficult it is to actually get a roadside marker, right?
Yes.
The kinds of things, the hoops that you have to go through just in order to get someone recognized or memorialized.
Yeah. Hey, Aspen, I can talk about that for a minute. There's a few different levels of this. I mean, some people would ask me, like, why don't you just put up markers yourself? Like, why make this book? Why make these photographs? Why don't you just go do the work? And I realized that for me to kind of hide Jack, the process of remembering would have been really damaging, because talking to community members and family members, the process of their loved ones becoming remembered in their community was part of their process of healing and their process of closure. And in the oral history, Denise Jackson Ford talks about that she wanted a marker to remember her father, Warless Jackson, who was murdered in Natchez, Mississippi. No one was ever convicted of his murder. And he was murdered at the Armstrong Rubber and Tire Company, which you can see here. And the day I was there, it said "Pray for Peace," which I felt like was such a call for response on that site. And then in the book, you then get to the narrative, which talks about what happened to Warless Jackson in 1965 when he was, in 1967 when he was murdered by Klansmen, when a car bomb was placed under his car. But then you get this oral history with Denise Jackson Ford, his daughter. And in part of it, she talks about like knowing who the killers were, not leaving town, like growing up in a community where she knew that her father's killers were there.
Living side by side with it.
Living side by side. She worked in the school district. She was teaching their children. But, so she tried to get a marker put up, and a supervisor in Natchez with the Adams County Board of Supervisors, they had tried to raise money for the marker, and it turned out that they were unable to do it. And then the money was not there. And she said, okay, what do I need to do? And so she wrote an article in the newspaper, and money started pouring in from community members, and the community funded the marker and kind of stood with her and made that happen. And that to her was her closure. She says at the end of her oral history, I accomplished what I wanted to do, and the people of Natchez supported us. I was elated. My closure is to know that I have this marker in his honor. And that the community stood up and acknowledged it. So, and this is an image from a couple of years ago of that marker on Minor Street where he lived. And I loved standing there in the school bus passing by and imagining all those children kind of becoming aware of that marker as they walk to and from school, as they pass by it, stop at the red light and can read it, and learning about Warless Jackson, who worked for the NAACP, who was active in his community, and was and paid the ultimate price. But yeah, so really thinking about those markers, and even there's another oral history with Stanley Dearman, who was an editor at the Neshoba Democrat in Philadelphia, Mississippi, Neshoba County, where the civil rights summer murders occurred. Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were murdered. Yes. And he talks about the tri-racial coalition that got together to think about how do we remember. And there are markers up around Neshoba County, but they did something that was so powerful, which is that they felt like they needed to demand justice, Haley, before they could just put up a marker. And so they wrote a resolution as a triracial coalition to get the case reopened, which was instrumental in bringing convictions for those murders. And then the marker went up after time and much discussion, and accountability has to come into this conversation. You can't just circumvent all of that. Right. But Stanley Dearman in his oral history talks about how important we have to keep telling ourselves and each other that this happened here, and it can never happen again. And what do we have to be constantly reminded and activated. He talks a lot about the activation of that kind of gesture.
And the activation of this space that was unmarked.
Yes. And the activation of the community and acknowledging that and having to come and face one another and say to one another, this happened. Mm-hmm. And some people were, complicit in ways, and that is a process.
Right. And that process, you point to all the red tape that one has to go through in order to be able to, whether it's put a call out in an article in a newspaper, to have funds come in, or really to go through other processes in order to get markers like this erected. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you is about other challenges that you might have had in doing this work, other challenges that you might have in some way encountered in order to realize this project. And maybe you could show us some more of the images from the book. Thank you.
Challenges, gosh, I sometimes just think of it as like process and not challenges. It's just like,
that's a good way to think about it.
They just are what they are, and I felt like I had to be really open to how this process evolved.
Right.
I learned a lot, obviously, in making this work. But yeah, I mean, I think access is part of the process. I won't call it a challenge because I think the even if it took longer than I wanted to, I often felt like that was appropriate. One thing I will say as a challenge, and I also say this as like a call to everyone about archives, is some of our archives are in crisis. And, we have some really important archives and they're on microfiche and in secure spaces. Or, I was talking to Charles Henry, whose father Isaiah Henry died, and I had talked to a journalist and before I went, and he was like, could you please try to get Isaiah Henry's death certificate so that we can reopen the case? And so I asked Isaiah's son, Charles, do you have the death certificate? And he was like, no, it was in Charity Hospital, destroyed during Hurricane Katrina. And so pieces of paper like that, kept that from being able to be thoroughly explored. So there are parts of our archives that need protecting. And that's part of the corrective work as well, because they've been undervalued just as these stories have been undervalued. And that is part of systematic racism and institutionally. And so that also has to be part of the corrective work. So I would say that accessing archives is a challenge that I experienced at times. And then other parts of the process were really about having to work on it long enough that I could prove myself to the people that I was working with or that I was asking to share as part of the project. And that was part of the process. But I will take you through.
Can I ask you,
Oh, yeah.
Can I just ask you to follow up on that? Because one of the things that you talked about was trust, right? Mm-hmm. That you have to work on it long enough, that you have to have the ability to share and also, earn the trust of the people that you're working with. Could you say something about that in terms of thinking about, whether it's working as a photographer artist or whether it's also doing the archival research that you do, whether it's part of this corrective process that your work is very intimately engaged in terms of exposing, the way in which certain kinds of, systematic violence and systematic structural racism is at the very foundation, of this country. And so you're looking back historically, but we can also think about the way in which we're being affected right now through this crisis, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And I think that if you go down the trail of civil rights, as many scholars and artists you end up in directly in justice issues, educational issues, access, healthcare issues, and that's all what we're seeing very much so today.
Coming together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So trust. I mean, I think, just to put it simply, hi Jordana, is that I think when you're asking people to share stories of trauma, that takes trust, and that takes careful boundaries, and that you have to be really responsible to that. And so that was something that I thought a lot about. I often talked in terms of process, I did all the research and all the photographing, which included meeting with family members who often had to take me somewhere or something like that. And then I went back after that was all over and did the oral history separately. And so I didn't try to do it all at the same time. I think that helped in terms of that process, because they're like, oh, you're still doing this? Or like,
you care.
This is the 6th year that you're still doing this, the 6th year you're calling me, and for some people, it didn't work. Like, they didn't want to be recorded. And so the conversations we had kind of off the recorder were the conversations that I came into this with, and then others who did share and who have been really kind of gratified by their inclusion in this book. So just to kind of get a sense of how we move through the book, I'll just maybe take you through the beginning. And forgive my copy. I have like stars on it and tabs. It's my reader copy. It's how
it's
I know.
It's your author's copy.
It's my author's copy. It's how I know it's mine when I'm at events. I don't pick up someone else's. So, you start here. I was really happy that the publisher was supportive of my idea I'm just going to actually kind of crouch here, to have really black pages here. And then you enter, and I can talk about these stars in a minute that show up throughout the book.
Great.
And you get to this piece of archive, which says it's from the Herbert Lee Press, which was a Freedom School press in Amite County, Mississippi. And it says, people here and all over want to know what the MFDP, which is the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, finds and does about the murdering of Lee and Allen, about quiet nights and the burning of crosses, the hot days in the green pines. That piece of archive to me felt so important at the beginning of the book, because it was about the relationship of place to the violence that occurred there. And I felt like that was really significant in this book, is to understand the context of both the violence and the resistance. You had to understand place and where this was playing out. And you get, this is a swamp in Midnight, Mississippi, and which was found in the Sunflower River. And this is the history about Rainey Poole, who was murdered in April of 1970. He was picked up and beaten by a group of white men and dumped in the Sunflower River. The charges were, do you want me to just read the whole thing? How is our time?
Oh, we've got about 30 minutes, but we also want to leave some time for folks to also post questions. So please use the question function to do that.
Okay.
And we can also look at some of the images, and maybe if you could also share, because right now we're looking at Jessica's photographs, but share some of the other structural pieces of the book and of your research in terms of some of the archival elements of what you had to put together.
So you come into Midnight, which was the home of Rainey Poole, which is a really significant early story for me. You get to the title page, and then you get to this piece of ephemera, which is from an FBI file about Jimmy Lee Griffith, which is courtesy of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And it's been redacted, but it says Department of Justice simply because a Negro is involved. And then the rest is redacted. And that, for me, was a really important beginning page to this. And then this is a piece of archive. It's from an address by Merle Evers Williams, Medgar Evers, widow to the crimes of the Civil Rights Conference at Northwestern University. And I'm just going to read for one quick second, this piece of archive. So this is, she said this in response when someone asked her how she felt when Byron de la Beckwith, the murderer of Medgar Evers, was convicted. She said, "You could hear the footsteps. We were seated and the guilty verdict was read. How did I feel at that moment? I can honestly say that every bit of anger, every bit of hatred, of fear escaped from every pore of my body when that verdict was read, and I felt free. But I also felt that America, my people, all people were freer when that verdict was read." She goes on to talk about how she kept her promise to Medgar by continuing to kind of pursue justice, and that she felt that she had done her job. But I'm going to skip down because I feel like it's really relevant to what's happening right now in the United States.
Well, we had also, I was going to say we had also, okay, go on. I'll come back to it.
Okay. She goes on to say, "I kept my promise to Medgar, but my job was not finished because more needed to be done. As we meet here and talk about how to go about it, I have another concern. How do we who have been there and are dying off now, how do we, those who are the generations behind me and behind them, transfer the dedication, the knowledge, the appreciation of all that has gone on before to a generation now where so many see it as something long ago that does not impact them at all?" And this is what I keep thinking about even today. We not only have to remember the past, we have to make the link to the next generation coming along. If we don't, we will find ourselves in another kind of civil war. another kind of hard that we will not know how to take care of. We must have a sense of protecting our rights, of saying one who has will share with one who does not, and that includes knowledge.
Mm-hmm. I'm so happy that you were able to read that, and also thinking about the kind of work that you do as an educator, that we're doing as educators at the AUCR Collective, and the type of work that many of our students are engaged in. I think it has much to do with really understanding and thinking about ways that we can, in a sense, I want to say pass the baton to the next generation of scholars and artists who are going to be doing this kind of work. And it's really important to think about that, in terms of mentorship and in terms of really being able to tell the stories, to continue to tell the stories that count. I wanted to ask you, just in terms of the structure of the book again, like if you could maybe share with us a couple of other
Sure.
pieces that are foundational for you. And one of the things that I was thinking about with regards to this work that you've done is we have this book, and for my class, when you joined us, and again, thank you, this was when we all went to teaching our classes via Zoom and other formats. Jessica came in to the Slavery and Visual Culture seminar, and our students had the ability to have access to your book through the AUC Woodruff Library. So shout out to the AUC Woodruff Library.
Mm-hmm.
I see Sarah's on. And also because it's an ebook, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
again, talking about access, and especially educational access, and continuing to make sure that these stories, which are not just stories, these are the ways that our lives have been affected and history has been shaped and changed, that they are available to people through means that include ebooks and others. Because right now it's kind of not so easy to get things that are, hard copies.
Right. No, I mean, the ebook is really important, and that is thanks to UNC Press. When I heard that was possible, I really did want to jump on that, just because this is a book that I mean to be widely kind of accessed, because I do think this book is also contributing to the archive and becomes part of the archive. And so I don't want it to be something that is like really kind of overly, it's precious to me, but as an object, I want it to be easily accessed and not kind of this overly kind of precious or commodified object that makes it difficult for people to get their hands on.
Right.
Because the whole point of this, the whole driving force of this is to tell these stories. So I think I'm going to go where you want me to go, Cheryl. You tell me if I'm not. But
no, you're fine.
In terms of talking about structure, I worked with Elizabeth Moran, who is a designer, to think about how we structured this book. There's the photographs, right, which are of sites, and then there is the related kind of archival ephemera related to those sites. Then there's the narratives, which are white text on black. And that is really to think about the inversion, let me find one, of kind of the newspapers.
Right.
And also kind of referencing microfiche, which is like how I access so much of these stories. But also really want to focus on that inversion, because the newspaper articles at the time often were emphasizing the white perpetrator of racist violence or the white killers that were acquitted. And I really wanted to invert in these narratives the people that were resisting, or the people that were the victims of white racist violence. And so so the visual inversion as well, the white on black, was really important.
Well, I think you're talking about too, like, who is it, who can tell the story?
Yeah.
How do we tell our stories? How do we take control of telling our stories? And to be able to have also in your book this, not just the inversion, something that I think it's kind of subtle, but it's effective. But also when you have the clippings from whether it's FBI files or whether it's reprints of actual newspapers, that you can also access the black press, which has a different way
Yes.
of course, in telling these stories. So that when I look up, for example, the most recent and horrific case of Ahmed Aubrey, who was
Yes.
murdered while jogging at the age of 25 just a few days ago in southern Georgia, by white supremacists. When I look up that case, there's a difference between reading that on the route versus reading it in the mainstream press or seeing something in the mainstream news media or reading it through, Johanna's Instagram feed versus reading it on the mainstream press. So it's about
absolutely.
who has the power to tell these stories, which is also part of the reason why we're here having this conversation right now.
Yeah. And I think if you look at, Sean King's North Star and Grassroots Law and sites like that are telling these stories, that is where you're getting an early and important perspective.
Right.
But thinking about voices and who has the power to tell these stories, I was thinking so much about the importance of family members' voices. And so you'll see this, that's also a tri-column, and really thinking about how these histories are filling in the gaps of the news histories at the time to kind of really, they're giving you more kind of the texture, the daily life, the impact that these events had on them as individuals and throughout their lives for decades, but also on their communities. And how the justice, or often usually lack of justice,
right.
also impacted them. And then we really I didn't do any other essays because I really wanted it to be primarily the voices from the oral histories,
right.
which was a structural choice as well. One thing that comes up in one of the oral histories, which I felt like was significant, was, and Stanley Nelson, who's a journalist at the Concordia Sentinel and Faraday, talks about this. I know it's not
Stanley's film. Yeah.
But I learned from talking to journalists and investigators that, cases that had murkier case files or cases that had double jeopardy restrictions, cases where the suspects or witnesses were dead, those often get passed over in these new Department of Justice investigations, et cetera, because they're not going to really result in a conviction. And the Department of Justice is trying to go for cases where they think a conviction is possible. And so realizing how important storytelling, both by journalists and family members and all of us, is for resurrecting some of these that for this other kind of reason are also being left out,
right.
which comes up with the journalist Stanley Nelson in this book.
So I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about your practice, about what led you to become an artist, a photographer. I know that you've done work with Cause Collective, that you're someone who, and I think your book is an example of this, that you're a collaborator. You go out and you work with other people and you work well with other people. You also worked on the Four Freedoms Project. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yes. I love working in a team, whether it's at work, as an educator or as an artist or within a community working on a project. I think one thing that my practice brings to me is the ability to feel connected to others. And that is a driving force in the work, and to really be impacted by others and to have that empathetic and personal connection to others. I love collaboration. I think as an artist, collaborating with the Cause Collective and collaborating with Hank Willis Thomas, Ryan Alexiev, on projects, finding that, through collaboration, a project becomes so much more than it would if it was just you working on it. It goes in different directions. It grows, you learn things. I collaborated recently on the exhibition Rising Water about artists working in response to hurricanes at the Museum of Fine Arts at Florida State University with the curator Meredith Lim there. And I collaborated with Four Freedoms, which is run by Hank Willis Thomas and Eric Godesman, on their 50 States Billboard project, which I loved because I was able to put up a billboard for Vernon Damer in Jackson, Mississippi. Vernon Damer Sr. is part of this book. He worked for helping African Americans around Hattiesburg, Mississippi, register to vote, and he was murdered because of it. And a couple of weeks after he passed, his voter registration card came in the mail. And so he was murdered for helping people get the right to vote, and he never got to cast a ballot himself. And so was able to put up a billboard that said "Vote for Vernon," and kind of gave a couple sentences about his life outside of Mississippi. And as part of the 50 States project that Four Freedoms did to get out the vote in 2018. And that was a really special collaboration for that to come full circle.
Are the billboards still standing? Do you know?
They're not still up. No.
Okay.
It would be great to do it again as we enter.
Yeah, I think we kind of need to do it again. We need to do it again.
Yeah.
And you said that Vernon...
Are you still on this call?
Well, you said that the story behind Vernon's murder is also in your book.
Yes, Vernon Damer Sr. is the last story. I started with Rainy Pool because I felt like going into Midnight Mississippi helped me understand kind of the impact place of what it would be like to have someone disappeared from a community of that scale, the reverberation of that often systematic racist violence in communities. Hi, Kate. And I ended with Vernon Damer because my visit with Vernon Damer Jr. was really impactful to this project, and it just felt like the bookends of the project. So when I first contacted Vernon Damer Jr., he said that he would not talk to me. And the next few times he kept saying that his story was not for sale, that everyone wanted to talk to him. And so why was he going to talk to me? And I kept kind of calling and checking in and trying. And then as the project evolved, I got to know Jerry Mitchell, who's an investigative reporter that helped solve his father's murder, who gave me a recommendation. And so I was allowed to go to their house in Kelly Settlement outside of Hattiesburg and sit down with Mr. and Mrs. Damer and present my project for review to see if they would decide to talk to me. So I'm in the living room presenting the project. And at the end of it, he's like, okay, let's go. And I'm like, okay, I think I passed. And so I got into his truck and we drove around. He told me the history of Kelly Settlement, which his ancestors had been enslaved on, and now he owns most of and harvests timber there. But Vernon Damer Sr. was murdered in 1966. He was the president of the NAACP chapter in Hattiesburg and a leader in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He helped voters in that county by letting them pay their poll tax in his store. And he was often quoted as saying, if you don't vote, you don't count. On January 9th, 1966, on the radio, he offered to pay Black voters poll taxes himself to help them vote. And then the next day, his home and store were bombed, and he died several days later. Samuel Bowers, who was an Imperial Wizard of the White Knights of Mississippi, and other Klansmen were released for his murder with hung juries. Bowers had already served 6 years for his involvement in the civil rights murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner during the civil rights summer. But Bowers was retried in 91 and sentenced to life in prison in 98 for ordering the murder of Vernon Damer Sr., which Jerry Mitchell was instrumental